Welcome and good evening. My name is Annette and I'm president of the Saratoga Historical Foundation. Before we start, I'm going to ask you to please turn off your mic and your video camera because we are recording this presentation. So we'll just take a minute and ask you once again to please turn off your mic and your video camera. If you have any questions during the presentation, please use chat at the bottom of your screen. The questions will be answered at the end of the presentation. So now I'd like to tell you a little bit about the Saratoga Historical Foundation. Next slide, please. The mission of the Saratoga Historical Foundation is to preserve the rich history of Saratoga for the education and enjoyment of the community. We provide exhibits, lectures, as well as a class for pioneer living for young students, a scholarship, an essay contest, as well as an 8-page newsletter. Visit 20450 Saratoga Los Gatos Road and see the museum in a 1904 building, an 1850s fully furnished pioneer cottage, a one-room schoolhouse, and soon a blacksmith exhibit. For more events, go up to www.saratogahistory.com. We're also sponsored today by the Organization of Chinese American Women, a nonprofit organization founded in 1977 and headquartered in Washington, D.C. The Silicon Valley chapter was founded in 1986 for the purpose of advancing and advocating for the needs and concerns of Asian American women by helping to improve their educational, economic, social, and political opportunities. Members are encouraged to serve the community as volunteers/leaders. Many of our members are current and former school board members, city council members, and mayors. So I'm going to ask you one more time to please turn off your mic and your camera. Because I can hear everything you're saying. So please turn off your mic and your camera. The next slide, please.
You turn on the camera.
So this lecture series includes some additional lectures that are coming up on September 27th. We have the history of the IOOF and the Saratoga retirement community. The IOOF is an independent order of Oddfellows and a non-political, non-sectarian fraternal order of Odd Fellowship. I know you'll find it fascinating. In October, we have the Onizika Air Force Base / Blue Cube. The nickname of the main building at Onizika Air Force Base in Sunnyvale, California, which was a 5-story windowless building surrounded by radar antenna and painted blue. For many years, it was Silicon Valley's ground zero, the most likely target in the event of Soviet nuclear attack. On November 17th, we have Riding the Rails, the Interurban Rail, which talks about transportation that was provided by the Interurban Rail between 1904 and 1934. So for more events, go up to www.saratogahistory.com. And now I'm going to introduce our speaker for tonight, which is Ray Cosyn. He's our historian for the Saratoga Historical Foundation. Ray?
Thank you, Annette, for the introduction. And it is my pleasure to present this story of the Flying Tigers. And it's more than the Flying Tigers, it's the American Air Force in China. And I learned that after having spoken to a man by the name of Bud Rideout, and we'll talk about Bud here in a minute or so. Everything that Americans knew about the Flying Tigers came out in 1942, when in fact a movie was made called Flying Tigers. And it was 1942 was a year of defeats. With the exception of Midway, we were losing in Europe as the Germans were taking over Russia. And the Japanese had been very tough on the Americans in the Guadalcanal and Guadalcanal slot. So it was a year of defeats. So it was FDR wanted something from Hollywood to boost the morale of the people. And that was the movie entitled Flying Tigers. Come on. And the Flying Tigers starred none other than John Wayne, who was a big Western hero and a big hero in Hollywood. So I learned about the Flying Tigers from a member of the 14th Air Force, Lieutenant Colonel Bud Rideout, who was a member of our museum. And Bud flew with the in China with the 5th Fighter Group of the 14th Air Force. And the 14th Air Force was essentially viewed as an extension of the Flying Tigers, because the Flying Tigers, as we're going to find out here in a minute, was an American volunteer group. And when the United States entered the war in December of 1941, the Flying Tigers role in China was taken over by the 14th Air Force. And Bud flew 38 missions, and he was shot down on the 39th. He retired from the Air Force after 22 years. And he told us some great stories about his missions. He was apparently shot down and found by a group of Chinese civilians, farmers, who were able to rescue him and keep him away from the Japanese. So how did before I get into it, here's a picture of the Flying Tigers, the American Volunteer Group, which I want to cover off here in a minute. And I want to expand this by talking about the Chinese view of the Flying Tigers, which was more than the American Volunteer Group. It consisted of the 10th Air Force, who flew the Hump, the 14th Air Force, which Bud was a member of, and Jimmy Doolittle's raid on Tokyo, which wound up in China. There's Bud. Whoops, going the wrong direction. So how did it begin? Well, it began in Manchuria. And there, at the turn of the last century, in the war between Japan and China, Japan lost the Korea, and Korea became a Japanese protectorate. And it was from there that the Japanese entered Manchuria. They entered Manchuria in an incident that they staged in September of 1931. And that allowed the Japanese to enter Manchuria, which set the stage for an incident at the Marco Polo Bridge. And that was in July of 1937. And that effectively marked the beginning of the Japanese-Sino War The Japanese were interested in raw materials and manpower. Just to put that into perspective, Japan had a population at that time of about 75 million, and there were 500 million Chinese. So this was a ready place for Japan to be able to answer its manpower needs. So after the Marco Polo Bridge incident, there was rapid Japanese expansion into China. The Battle of Shanghai, where there were 270,000 deaths, and that was in August of 1937. So it was roughly about a month after the Marco Polo Bridge incident. And then there was the rape of Nanking, which was on December of 1937, where there were 250,000 deaths. By 1941, there were 2 million Japanese in China. There had been 4 million Chinese casualties, and the nationalists had retreated to Chungking. At the time, the United States took action and put an embargo on both steel and oil to Japan. And that, of course, set the sights for the follow-on attack on Pearl Harbor by the Japanese. So in order to continue operating at the beginning of the war, the Chinese, working with the British, had built a road called the Burma Road. And the Burma Road was built to link Burma at the time with China. And that was extremely important. There were over 200,000 Chinese involved in building the road. That was from 1937 until 1938, with conscripted labor. And you can see how difficult it was. The road itself was closed in May of 1942. It was 717 miles long from Burma to Kunming. It went through passes at 80, which were up to 8,500 feet. So it was, they used chain suspension bridges. It was very difficult, but it was the lifeline into China during the early part of the war. The Chinese had an air force. Air Force was essentially supported by German, Italian, and Russian advisors. Its task was to protect the road, the Burma Road, and to slow Japanese advance. Well, a better solution was required, and Chiang Kai-shek and Madam Chiang recognized this. And in 1937, Madam Chiang came to the United States and recruited Claire Chenault. And this was before the war began. Chenault was a retired captain in the U.S. Army Air Corps who had retired for medical reasons. He believed in pursuit aircraft, very important, which was really required in order to combat the Japanese in China. His task was to initially survey and organize the Chinese Air Force in an American mold, and to learn Japanese tactics. He eventually, when the United States entered the war, Chenault returned to the U.S. Air Force, which was in the spring of 1942. So FDR signed in April of 1941 a secret order. And the secret order was to put together an American volunteer group, which was the first iteration of the Flying Tigers. The AVG, as it was referred to, was to have 266 planes, 100 pilots, and 900 support personnel. The overall reason was to use China as a second front against Japan. And of course, that really never did happen. So here you can see the first AVG. They went into training in July of 1941. They saw their first action on December 21st, 1941. That was 2 weeks after the United States entry into the war, which was, of course, on December 7th. They started with 3 squads of 20 aircraft. Of the 60, only 43 were serviceable. Pilots volunteered. They volunteered with the support of the United States government, and they made roughly about $144,000 a year in today's money, which at the time was like $600 a month. So here you see the aircraft. The aircraft that was used was the P-40 Tomahawk, built by Curtiss Wright, Allison engines, and they were based in Rangoon in Burma. And they, of course, featured the shark motif. Now, there's been a lot said about the shark motif, but it's interesting to note that the shark motif actually showed up in World War I, and it was used again in World War II in North Africa. The British liked it so well that they put it on their aircraft in the Asian theater, and it was then incorporated into these P-40s, which gave them a rather stunning profile. As part of the uniform, the pilots would wear what is called a blood chit. And the blood chit essentially was a message to Chinese that the pilot should be given all support. And it's written in Chinese, and it was also had an English, and it had a German translation as well. So it was part of the survival kit. So the what you see is the Flying Tigers. Their plan was to attack the supply lines, Japanese supply lines. And it was they also was a defense of Rangoon. And Rangoon was, of course, their base. The first air battle was on December 21st of 1941. And over a 10-week period, using 25 serviceable aircraft in 31 encounters, they destroyed 217 Japanese planes. As the Japanese would fly out of China and into Burma and attempted to destroy the Flying Tiger base in Burma. So destroyed 217 Japanese planes, lost 16 P-40s and 4 pilots. So it was, the ratio was rather dramatic and like 1 to 14. And people said, well, how were they able to do this? Well, they have learned how to use the P-40. The P-40 was an aircraft that had been built for the French. And when France fell in June of 1940, there were a group, 100 aircraft, which were offered to the British. And the British saw them as not being what they wanted to use in defense of Britain. So they became available, and they became available to the Flying Tigers. And the Tigers learned to be able to use those effectively. And by effectively, they would climb to great heights, great altitudes, and dive on dive in such a way that the Japanese had a very difficult time being able to follow them. So they were very, very effective. So here you can see, their main operation in China. And again, it was to protect the Burma Road and support Chinese ground forces. But the Burma Road, as you will find out here in a little bit, really became not something that you wanted to spend a lot of effort on, because it wound up being closed. The Flying Tigers ended their operation on July 4th of 1942. They had whipped the Japanese Air Force in more than 50 battles. They destroyed 299 Japanese planes, and they lost 12 P-40s. So that was in the Chinese theater. So following the Flying Tigers, the American Volunteer Group, came the 14th Air Force, which my friend Bud Rideout was a member of, and it was created in March of 1943. And it started with 200 planes and grew to 700 by war's end. They began flying an aircraft called the P-47 Thunderbolt. The Thunderbolt, Bud would refer to the Thunderbolt as that bucket of bolts, but it's what he flew initially. He destroyed 2.21 million tons of shipping, 2,600 Japanese aircraft. They lost 500 planes. General Takahashi said that they constituted 60 to 70% of the opposition that they were fighting. And without the 14th Air Force and their predecessor, the American Volunteer Group, they could have gone anywhere in China. The P-47 was followed up by the P-51 Mustang, which was the gold standard of pursuit aircraft. It was built by North American in 1940, roughly about 2 years after the P-47. And it was quite effective. And Bud felt that this was clearly the best option that he had ever flown. So we look beyond this and look the road, the Burma Road, which was effectively the reason why the Flying Tigers initially, AVG, was put together, was closed in May of 1942. And so there had to be an option. And you can see the reason why it was closed was because the Japanese ground forces had moved into Burma and had closed off the LASHIO, and which was one of the takeoff points to Kunming, because it was Calcutta to Lashio to Kunming. And Kunming was where, in fact, the flights would wind up landing once, in fact, they're able to cover off the loss of the Burma Road. So we had to do something in order to replace the Burma Road, and that was an airlift. And this was not easy. The Himalayas had to be crossed, and the Himalayas experienced 200 inches of rain, wind shear of 200 miles per hour, 100 mountains exceeding 23,000 feet, with passes at 15,000. And so what we did was have an airlift where we flew through the Himalayas. It was put together by the 10th Air Force under the direction of General Tunner. And it had never been done before. It had been built from scratch, and started May of 1942 with 27 DC-3s. And DC-3s were unpressurized. You know, they had essentially, you could fly them at about 5,000 feet. We were taking them up to 15,000 feet. We moved from the DC-3 to the C-47, B-24s, et cetera. And by 1943, we had 142 aircraft in operation. Toledo to Kunming, 6,200 feet, 500 miles. There was no room for emergency landings. You could lift 12,000 feet, and you had a ceiling of 12,000 feet. So it was very perilous. They were essentially at 12,000 feet, when in fact the aircraft itself was designed to support 6,000 feet. They carried fuel, spare parts, personnel. In 1942, 300 tons of material carried. In 1945, in January, 44,000 tons on 249 aircraft using 17,000 personnel. By July of 1945, there were 662 aircraft delivering 71,000 tons in 1 month. So if you can imagine, there was an aircraft taking off about once every 3 minutes. During that time, the 10th Air Force lost 609 planes and 1,500 personnel. So here is a picture of one of the aircraft. This is C-47 Skytrain. And this shows the building of the runway at Kunming. Again, this was all done using manual labor. There were no Caterpillar tractors available, no machines to crush rocks. It all had to be done by hand. And here's the Kunming airfield at 6,200 feet. You know, mountains on all 3 of the 4 sides. So it was a harrowing experience, to say the least. And here you can see the material being offloaded off one of the aircraft. And then, of course, it was then transferred to the front using whatever facilities were available. And this shows the use of a junk. And going back to the Burma Road, as I said before, was opened in 1938, built in 37, and closed in 1942. And it was reopened in 1945. However, it wasn't being used because it was no longer needed. The sky bridge that had been put in place made the road itself obsolete. So the United States entered the war in December of 1942. And it's essentially was a result of the oil and steel embargo that was put in place when the Japanese invaded China. And it put the United States in very, very much a defensive position. So FDR, Franklin Roosevelt, wanted a plan to strike back at the Japanese. And what was done was to have Doolittle, General Doolittle, put together a group of hand-picked flyers to fly over Japan and to land in China. Now you might say, how do you do that? Because Japan's about 6,000 miles away from San Francisco. So one has to put together a plan where we used an aircraft carrier, namely the Hornet, and which had been launched in December of 1940. And it left the Alameda with 16 B-25 Mitchell bombers. And that had never been done before. I mean, you could have pursuit aircraft, smaller aircraft flying. These were twin engine bombers. So here is a picture of the B-25s. The idea was to attack Tokyo and Yokohama, and then to land in China with the idea that the Chinese would then in turn provide them with support and get them back out of the country. So here you can see the very brave men getting ready to fly, taking last minute orders, and knowing that that they had a tough time coming up, and they had to take off early. There were 71 officers and 130 enlisted men. You know, and they were seen by a Japanese fishing boat, which essentially was looking for outliers who would come into the home waters. So they took off 170 miles early, 650 miles from Tokyo, in 30-foot swells. So thinking about that, this picture, which I found just recently, I think really brings it home. That's the Golden Gate Bridge, and that's the Hornet, and there are the 16 B-25s that were used in the attack on Tokyo. So it was, I found that to really touch home, because it is our home. And here you can see General Doolittle with members of his crew 13 of the 16 crews made it safe. 2 fell into Japanese hands and were executed. 1 fell into the hands of the Soviet Union. So when FDR was questioned as to where those planes came from, he said Shangri-La, which I found to be rather remarkable, adding a little levity to the press. So here are some of the monuments to the Flying Tigers, and that's the US Air Force. This is in Kunming. Here's one in Chungking, and then a major monument in Nanking. So what was the cost of this little war? I say little war. This was the war we fought in China and its environs. 870 Chinese, 236 Soviets, over 2,000 Americans, and 2 Koreans, all killed in action in China during World War II. If you want to read more about the American Volunteer Group, there's a book called The Flying Tigers by Daniel Ford, which I've read more than once, which is a great outline story of the Flying Tigers and their unbelievable efforts in both Burma and China. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Annette, who's going to tell me what sort of questions have come up so that hopefully I can answer those questions the best I can. Annette?
I'm here. Can you hear?
I think you just went off the air, or you?
Now, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Perfect.
Yes, indeed.
Okay, so just as a reminder, we have recorded this presentation and we will be posting it on our website at www.saratogahistory.com. And we hope you'll come up and tell your friends about it. And I thank you, Ray, for a great presentation. We do have some questions. One was, why was the Burma Road important?
Well, the Burma Road was the only way in which the Allies could resupply Chiang Kai-shek, because the Japanese had moved in from the north and had taken essentially every major city, every port along the coast. So there was no way of getting materials in that direction. The north, of course, was the Soviet Union. And at that time, the relationship was not there and the materials weren't there. So the best way of getting materials to Chiang Kai-shek was through Burma. So there had to be a road built, and that road was built or started before the Japanese engaged the Chinese. But the Chinese saw that coming, so that's why they built the Burma Road. So it was in action for roughly about 2 years, maybe a year or two on the front end, and maybe a few months later. But as I point out, the airlift more than made up for the lack of the road, and then some.
Here's another question. What is the pursuit aircraft?
Pursuit aircraft designed to do battle in close quarters with aircraft like the Zero, which was the Japanese pursuit aircraft. So they're fairly light, big engine, and a lot of weapons. They weren't designed to carry bombs or anything of that nature, but they were essentially designed to enter into close combat.
Did the Flying Tiger P-40s ever fly against the Japanese Zeros?
Yes. In fact, that's what the Zeros were. That's what the Japanese were flying into Burma and into China, were Zeros. They were flying Zeros, and they were flying their bombers called Bettys. So there was a combination, but it was basically the Zeros. But the beauty of the tactics that were developed by the Flying Tigers was to gain altitude and to drop down on the Japanese aircraft. And they did not have the speed to catch up with them. The Zeros were essentially a great aircraft at close range, where in fact you're flying at the same altitude. So then as good an aircraft as the Zero was, it was no match for the P-51 Mustang, which was essentially the gold standard for pursuit aircraft.
Thank you. Is the Burma Road being used today?
It may be, but I'm not sure there's a lot of activity on it, because it is, I mean, it was built at great expense, at great altitude, and there are other pathways into China. Well, today, of course, the entire coast is open. So I would doubt that it sees a lot of use.
Why did the Flying Tigers planes have sharks and not have tigers painted on them?
That's a good question. I've done a little research there. The first time the Flying Tiger teeth showed up was in World War I. And the Germans used them on their aircraft. And then in World War II, in North Africa, again, the Germans were using these teeth, and they decided that, hey, those things look great. And so the British put them on their aircraft. And then when we, with the P-40, were involved with them in Southeast Asia, the idea was, hey, these things look radical. They look scary. They could be seen from some distance. Let's employ them. So it wasn't tiger teeth, it was shark teeth. And there were a lot more shark teeth than there were tiger teeth.
Here's another question. Are you familiar with the original China Air from Shanghai, civilian, not military, that support Flying Tigers from Calcutta, Kunming?
No, I'm not. I'm really not. You say it was a civilian aircraft operation during the war, or after the war, or when?
Doesn't say. I'm going to go on to another.
As we know, members of the Flying Tigers, after the war, established an air cargo operation in the United States, which was quite successful and morphed into, I believe, Federal Express.
Okay. Where is the Marco Polo Bridge located?
It is in Beijing. And it's interesting. Beijing is right adjacent to Manchuria. So when the Marco Polo Bridge, when they had the incident, on one side you had the nationalist Chinese on one side of the bridge, on the other side of the bridge you had the Japanese. And so the question was, when would the war begin? And the Japanese army was essentially operated with little direction from Tokyo. And so what they did was they staged an incident on that bridge, which led to an exchange of fire between the Japanese and the Chinese, and gave Japan a reason to invade China.
How many of the Flying Tiger pilots were actually Chinese Americans?
I don't know that there were any. The men that I've seen were all selected from the U.S. Army, Air Corps, which of course existed before the Air Force, and the U.S. Navy. And they were hand selected by the Department of Defense because they wanted people with considerable experience, not necessarily engaging in combat, but being able to understand and be able to fly the P-40s as they should be flown.
When did the communist Chinese enter the fighting against Japan?
That's a very good question. As we know, China fell to Mao in 1949. And all during the war, the Chiang Kai-shek had most of his focus was on Mao Tse-tung and the Red Chinese, which were up in the northern part of China. So I do not know that there was an effort on the part of the Red Chinese. It also impacted the amount of resource or people that Chiang Kai-shek could spare to fight the Japanese, because he was concerned with the Red Chinese taking over China while he was focused on the Japanese. So it was a very tough position that Chiang Kai-shek was in.
Chinese pilots were sent to the US for training, but did they ever go back to China to fly in the war?
I have not read anything on that. I do not know the answer to that. I need to do my homework.
Okay, well, somebody said yes, they were, but that's
Good to know.
end. That's the end of the questions that have been submitted. I see one new message came in. In 1937, was Manchuria a separate country from China?
Yes, and in fact, it had been taken over by the Japanese. Japanese at Munkin, I believe it was Munkin, which was a staged, in 1931, the Munkin incident, which allowed or provided an entree for the Japanese to enter Manchuria. Manchuria became a protectorate, and it was called Manchukuo. And it was a from this protectorate, which began, in 1931, and it lasted until the end of the war.
Okay, we had this comment that said many Chinese AF pilots trained in the US ended up serving in 14th AF flying against the Japanese.
Ah, good to know.
We have a very
That is-
informed
that-
audience.
That's super. Super. Now, the 14th Air Force did some terrific work. And it's good to know that the Chinese were involved in the 14th Air Force. But it was a tough war, and the 14th Air Force was key in limiting the advance of the Japanese, because without the 14th Air Force, things would not have worked out as they did.
Someone commented that the 14th Air Force had a wing called the Chinese American Composite Wing, made up of Chinese Air Force and American Air Force pilots. Those Chinese pilots trained in the US were part of the composite wing.
Fantastic. Good to know.
And someone else mentioned relics of the Flying Tigers are in various museums, including museums in China, as well as in the US.
Mhm. Yeah, I'd point back to the book as well.
So I think that's the end of our questions, and we really had a very informative audience here. And I want to thank Ray for this very excellent presentation on a part of the history that we don't know as much as we should. And I really do appreciate it. And also we want to thank the OCAW for co-sponsoring this presentation. And I believe, Ray, you're also going to give this presentation again for the Rotary. Is that correct?
Yes. Yeah, that'll come up in, I believe, November, like November 7th. Let me just see, Rotary. Yeah, November 12th.
November 12th at the Saratoga Rotary. So if anybody is interested in, once again, seeing it live, you'll be able to hear Ray give this presentation again. And again, I want to thank Ray for just an excellent presentation, and for our audience for coming tonight. So thank you very much. Do go up to our website, www.saratogahistory.com, for other presentations as well as other recordings. And thank you all for attending.